For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse. It's a show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. You know, for Bad Bunny, a pop superstar that is no stranger to the number one spot on the Billboard charts, music and politics go hand in hand. Through his lyrics, you can hear the history of Puerto Rico, migration, inequities, and struggles. Bad Bunny has consistently used his platform for political activism, and people are taking notice. Now, Bad Bunny is coming to the Ivy League this fall. Yale University will offer a course called Bad Bunny, Musical Aesthetics and Politics. It's taught by our guest today, Professor Albert Laguna. This hour, we're exploring the intersection between pop and politics. Albert Laguna is an associate professor of American Studies and Ethnicity, Race, and Migration at Yale University. Professor Laguna, thank you so much for coming on the show.
A pleasure. Happy to be here.
Hey, Debí Tirar Más Fotos came out in 2025. The album has a title track I would consider a beach banger. There are synth sounds. You also hear a conga that's a staple of music from the island of Puerto Rico. I hear it one way. You may hear it another. So can you tell me what it means to you and what it means for what you do in life?
The song, but let me speak to the album more broadly, right?
Sure.
I think I can. So what does it mean to me? I think I can tell you by going to the first track when that song, Nueva York, starts the album, and it's sampling a song by El Gran Combo de Puerto Rico from the 70s called Un Verano Nueva York, a summer in New York. It's like I stood up at attention, right? This is the music that I grew up with, that my parents met dancing salsa in clubs in New York City too, and it's like it started there, right? And from that song on, right, it's what he's able to do with mixing these musical genres from Puerto Rico, the Caribbean. It tells a story of Puerto Rico's culture, but also of the movements of Puerto Rican and Caribbean culture across New York City, across the greater Caribbean. And so for me, it floored me, right? I was walking around New Orleans, especially listening to the album on repeat. New Orleans is a city with a lot of Caribbean energy. You can't tell the history of New Orleans without the Caribbean. And I just said, I have to teach a class on this album and Bad Bunny.
I'm glad you brought up the cultures and the Caribbean as a whole. I know that you're Cuban, and as I understand it, in the 80s particularly, and even before that, Cuban and Puerto Rican music were kind of intertwined, at least in terms of social music and social critiques. So that's very helpful for me to understand and our listeners to understand as well. Focus on the album here, and how would you describe your course, Bad Bunny, Musical Aesthetics and Politics, to a student or a fellow faculty member?
I think it's an opportunity to kind of drop into a broader discussion that centers Puerto Rico. There hasn't been a standalone course on Puerto Rico for quite a few years at Yale, which is unfortunate to say the very least, given how little students know about Puerto Rico and really the general public, specifically Puerto Rico's colonial status in relation to the United States. So it's an opportunity to explore that, taking Puerto Rico, a place that's been so marginal in kind of US mainstream discourse, and putting it at the center, right? To understand a variety of issues related to kind of cultural production, diaspora, racism, the evolution of musical forms, right? It's an opportunity to use this music as a way into much broader questions.
It's not the first time the subject of Bad Bunny has entered a classroom. You're not the first professor to teach this course. Later on in the show, we're going to hear from a Wellesley professor who has been teaching her students about the politics behind Bad Bunny's music since 2022. Your course has received a lot of attention, which you found interesting. Why is that?
Well, I think it's two things. First of all, Bad Bunny's at the height of his stardom. This album has received international acclaim for good reason, and he is extremely popular globally. He's one of the top streamed artists in the entire world for the last couple of years. But there's something about, and like you said, my colleagues Petra Rivera teach a class on reggaeton and Bad Bunny. I've taught courses on reggaeton and Caribbean popular culture my entire career. Petra and Professor Vanessa Diaz also curate an amazing website called the Bad Bunny Syllabus. That's just a wonderful resource for those wanting to kind of think about Bad Bunny alongside a number of interesting avenues: historical, political, gender politics, musical aesthetics. So, but this moment, the height of his stardom, right? You could say, but also like what Yale means as a place in the U.S. popular imagination. An article was published in the Yale Daily News, and I received a call the next day. Yale Daily News is the newspaper for Yale University, and I received a call the next day for the New York Times. You know, someone at his job at the New York Times is to monitor the Yale Daily News, or people are hearing from the Yale Daily News at the New York Times. I think I can assume that no one's monitoring articles published at my alma mater, Montclair State University in New Jersey, right? Yale has this kind of outsized place,
sure,
right, and kind of molding conversations about higher education in this country. So the fact that you put Yale and Bad Bunny together, it attracts attention. This news goes viral because, and this leads to my next point, one of the questions I get the most in these media interviews and from people on the street is just, how did Yale let you teach this course? Like, what was the process to get permission for this course? I, a scholar of Caribbean and Caribbean diasporic literature, popular culture, music, who was hired by Yale University to do this work, right? That Yale thought it was an intellectual priority to hire in this field at many levels, is being asked, like, how I got permission to do it, right? And I think that's just indicative of a lot about higher education, how it's talked about in this country, right? I think it has something to do also with popular culture and how popular culture is seen as kind of low, right? And if we put popular culture in Puerto Rico, it's even lower because of the racial and colonial politics around Puerto Rico. And I also think that Yale, and this is a part of the problem, right? That Yale is seen as a place where you study Greek statuary, Victorian novels that
in the Babbage Library,
beautifully. Yeah, just that's what you're doing, right? It's Greek statuary and Victorian novels, right? And my job as a scholar of popular culture is, yes, Jane Austen, yes, the Greek statuary, and yes, the Bad Bunny, because we can learn and develop questions and insights from this music, right, that are as valid and as important as the Greek statuary and Pride and Prejudice.
What are some of the major themes from the album Debí Te Dar Más Fotos? You talked about the experience of listening to it, but now talk about the experience of putting it into a lesson plan.
Yeah, so for me, it's the first song. The first title track is the first track of the album is Nueva York, right? It starts in New York. An album that people talk about as Puerto Rican starts in New York City, right? And that's critical to understand, because you cannot understand the history of Puerto Rico without New York, and you can't understand the history of New York City without Puerto Ricans, right? So right there, a major course theme is crystallized, that of migration and the movement between Puerto Rico and New York and back, really since the 19th century. Now, you talked about those Cubans and Puerto Ricans getting together. Cubans and Puerto Ricans have been collaborating in New York since the 19th century. So understanding the themes of migration, not only physical movement of migration, but also cultural migrations, right? So you can't understand salsa or reggaeton, just to leave it at those two, without understanding the movement of people across the Caribbean and across New York City and Puerto Rico. So it's metaphoric migration, right? It's cultural migration, and it's literal movement of bodies across these spaces. So that's a major theme of the class. Another thing we have to think about is kind of protest politics in this album, right? Bad Bunny's talking a lot about the difficult political situation in Puerto Rico, the corruption. He's talking about the economic difficulties that cannot be separated from the colonial relationship with the United States. And he's speaking to this through different musical forms, that have been utilized historically for protests, like plena, right? And what's really exciting for my students, where there's a great deal of low morale given the attacks on higher education by the Trump administration, right? That we can listen to protests, we can protest, and that can also be joyful, right? And this music gives us a way into thinking about that intersection.
Would you do me a favor and go into that a little further? The idea of joy. Is it that students will now understand that you have this protest song, you have people listening to it on the radio and enjoying it? Not this protest song, but this protest album. This is we're digging into this because your favorite newspaper in the world, there, the New York Times, is also digging into that angle as well about joyful protest music, but in a point too when there's intersectionality with Bad Bunny and gender politics as well. This is a time where we talk a lot about transgender folks and joy and trying to attach that because the situation can be dismal, but we want to also validate folks by talking about their experiences and saying that it's not all bad. There's a lot of good things about you just being here in existence. So help us talk about joy a little bit more here and unpack it.
I think so. I think if I can, let's see. There's so many ways to talk about it. First of all, it's just like the feeling of the music, right? How this music is music meant to be performed and enjoyed in community, right? So I think about the protests against the deposed governor of Puerto Rico in 2019, the Verano Boricua, right? There's the Puerto Rican summer where there were massive protests against the corruption of the Rosselló administration, and how the protests in San Juan were guided by music, right? It was people dancing and like making their voices heard, and it was musical. It was kinetic with dance, and it was people making their voices heard again in the streets, protesting against the corruption of this administration, right? So that's something to highlight as well. Um, there's something also about a joy of Puerto Ricanness that's continuously kind of indexed on this album. And if I can just point to something else that I think is really important, is again his spotlight on his presence in Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico for Puerto Ricans, right? We're seeing this massive migration from Puerto Rico in the 21st century, given the difficult economic conditions, the devastation from the hurricanes, and people having to leave because Puerto Rico is a very expensive place to live as well, and you have foreign capital from the United States coming in, people buying up properties. It's creating a lot of issues and reasons to migrate. So the importance of saying Puerto Rico for Puerto Ricans, and if I could just point to exactly what's most visible about this strategy is his residency in Puerto Rico this summer. He's performing
Mm.
30 concerts in Puerto Rico this summer. So often the trajectory is for an artist to make it big and then to immediately go on their European and the US tour. He's talked about a tour in Latin America. He's talked about a tour in Europe. He's released dates. He has not mentioned tour dates in the United States yet. I imagine they'll come at some point. But before he goes anywhere, he's going to do 30 concerts in Puerto Rico first between July and September.
In hearing interviews with Bad Bunny, he's always put his experience in Puerto Rico and going back there and performing as separate as, say, going worldwide and going to the United States, playing in New York or in Los Angeles or Coachella, as it were, or even now playing in Argentina or South America. So help us separate the two and why the intention behind doing all those shows in Puerto Rico.
I think it's just really important. Again, this idea of presence with so many people leaving, and so much about the album and the lyrics talking about again Puerto Rico for Puerto Ricans. What does it mean to say like "Aquí me quedo"? Like I'm gonna stay here, right? I'm gonna do this here first. So you want to see me? You got to come here, right? It kind of just shifts the entire narrative of how we think about artistic success, about making it big in the small place and then going to the bigger place. No, it's like I'm gonna stay here, and eyes have to be on Puerto Rico. Not to mention that this will be as fraught as it is. It will be an economic boost to the island, and that's complicated. That's a complicated conversation, but it will be an economic boost to the Puerto Rican economy, and that's something that I imagine he's also keenly aware of.
Help us close out the interview here with takeaways you'd like your students to have whenever they take this course. What would you like them to think about, and what kind of questions do you hope they'll ask the professor as they're learning?
Yeah, so I mean, it's everything I said about U.S. Puerto Rico relations, understanding Puerto Rico's colonial status, the experience of Puerto Ricans from the 19th century to the present through the prism of this status. It's a way to understand kind of artistic and aesthetic developments, movements, right? The way these different forms of music intersect and change over time, and the way they move across the Caribbean and the United States. But I think something else that's really important, especially for your listeners, is to understand that Bad Bunny is not unique, right? That his music is another link in the chain of global interest and fascination in music from the Hispanophone Caribbean in particular, right? Since the 19th century, right, music from the Caribbean has made the rounds of the world, right? It's mambo, it's salsa, it's cha cha cha, right? It's reggaeton, it's Bad Bunny. So to understand the longer history of this is also really key. And that's something I want to impart to my students.
Fabulous conversation. You've been listening to Albert Laguna, Associate Professor of American Studies and Ethnicity, Race and Migration at Yale University. Professor Laguna, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And after the break, a deeper dive into Bad Bunny's impact. Let us know if Bad Bunny's music speaks to you. 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Albert Laguna is an associate professor. Is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. Bad Bunny, a Puerto Rican pop star, is famous across the globe. It's not just his music that's earning him the spotlight. Bad Bunny has used his platform to advocate for social and political change. People could argue about whether or not that's actually happening, but that's what he's attempting to do, particularly in his home territory, Puerto Rico. This hour, we're digging into the intersection of pop and politics. Joining me now, Petra Rivera Rido, Associate Professor of American Studies at Wellesley College. Her new book, which she co-wrote with Vanessa Diaz, is titled PFKNR, How Bad Bunny Became the Global Voice of Puerto Rican Resistance. And that's going to come out in February of 2026. Kind of some breaking news there, Petra.
Yes. I'm very excited. Thanks for having me.
Also on, La Gata, multimedia artist and historian. Gata, wonderful to have you on here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. We appreciate it very much. Also joining us, Rachel Iacovone, Puerto Rican communities reporter for Connecticut Public. Thank you so much for coming on the Wheelhouse.
Thanks for having me.
You are fresh to Connecticut Public, and you are right on the show. That's how talented you are. Thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it. And my good buddy, Charles Venator Santiago, Associate Professor with a joint appointment in the Department of Political Science and El Instituto, the Institute for Latino, Caribbean, and Latin American Studies. Charles, thank you for joining us today.
Sorry for not being there personally.
You're there, man. You're here with us. We hope you'll join the conversation today. Give us a call, 888-720-9677. We have operators standing by to take your calls in both English and en español.
Si tienes algunas preguntas o comentarios, únete a la conversación en directo. Llámanos al 888-720-9677. Puedes hacerlo en inglés o en español.
That is the lovely Sabrina Herrera, who works with Rachel on our Somos Connecticut team. We'd love to get some calls, but Petra, first, I'd like to get your thoughts on what you just heard from Professor Albert Laguna, who is following you into this territory. You're a trailblazer on trying to connect Bad Bunny to politics, but of course, when we hear about the music of the island of Puerto Rico and politics, Bad Bunny's not the first musician to do this.
No, he's definitely not the first musician. And I think, like Albert, one of the things I try to do in my course at Wellesley is create this kind of historical background to show where Bad Bunny comes from. And I think one of the things that's pretty cool about Bad Bunny is that he does that frequently as well, both in the sampling, like Albert talking about him sampling the Gran Combo, but also in his performances, in his, there's like my favorite photo of Bad Bunny is this Rolling Stone cover where he's holding all these replicas of reggaeton chains from the early 2000s to show everybody who came before him. So he does that too. But yeah, I'm really excited that Albert's teaching his class at Yale. There's several Bad Bunny classes now. I know of some in Princeton, San Diego State, Barnard College.
They might be focusing on newer stuff. A lot of your coursework has,
Yes.
because you've done it for a couple of years now. It works. It looks at some of his earlier work. Can you help us with his evolution as an artist?
Yeah. Yes. So yeah, I started teaching my course in the fall of 2022. And since that time, he's released 2 other albums, Debí tirar más fotos, and then one in 2023 called Nadie sabe lo que va a pasar mañana. So Bad Bunny begins, like many young artists, in 2016 as a rapper who's posting his songs on SoundCloud. And he was singing Latin trap, which is a genre that is kind of adjacent to reggaeton, that is known for being very explicit, particularly sexually explicit. So it wasn't getting a lot of radio play. And I think one of the things that Bad Bunny did early in his career was figured out how to merge the sound of Latin trap with a few more radio-friendly lyrics sometimes to get his stuff out there. And he has always had, I think, and what we argue in the book, a political slant to his work. So one example I can think of is his very first television appearance in the United States was on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. And he sang a song called Estamos Bien, which lyrically is a song about making a lot of money. But in that song, he talks about things like driving through the potholes in Puerto Rico or the impact of the hurricane slipped into those lyrics. And when he goes on the Jimmy Fallon show, he starts by making a speech. And at that time, his English was really not great, right? So he gives this kind of slow but really important brief dialogue about how it's been 1 year since the hurricane and Donald Trump is still in denial. And then he starts his performance, right? So I think from his earliest access to these larger public platforms, Bad Bunny has been speaking out about issues that pertain to Puerto Rico, which, as Albert said, many people in the United States aren't aware of, right? And so I think that's always been a part of his MO. But what's different about Debí tirar más fotos is the sort of explicit nature of the politics that he's doing in every song with the blend of genres, with the topics he's talking about, with his music videos, right? It's very intentional. And it's very interesting to me because as Bad Bunny has become, one of the things we talk about in our book is as Bad Bunny has become more famous, he has leaned more into his political orientation, not less. And one of the arguments we're making is that that has actually increased his popularity, whereas some people might think that to be an international pop star, you have to step back from something that might be perceived as controversial. He seems to lean into it much more.
I appreciate that very much. That's a really great way to look at the history of Bad Bunny there since the beginning there, since he was like a college student making music.
Hmm.
I'm so privileged to have Gata on the show here today because the great work that you all did with the Loud podcast with Evie Queen, and that's on Spotify. I'm not sure if it's still on there, but people should try to find that because that is a terrific look at the roots of reggaeton to where we are today. Thank you for doing that work, Gata. I want to ask you for a history lesson here. In 1948, as I understand it, there was this gag law enacted in Puerto Rico to suppress an independence movement on the island. It made it illegal to fly the Puerto Rican flag or sing patriotic songs. Eventually repealed nearly a decade later on the grounds that it violated free speech. This is not the first battle that Puerto Rico would have with free speech and reggaeton. As a matter of fact, later on they would have that. But what role do you think that historical context plays in the mind of an artist like a Bad Bunny who is so outspoken today?
Hi, thank you so much for that question. Sorry, I'm a little caught off guard. And listening to like a lot of these conversations, but the role that plays in Bad Bunny, I mean, if I wasn't allowed to raise my flag, I'm Panamanian Jamaican for those who are listening, I know I'd be furious. And the moment that they would allow me, I would be obnoxious. I'm always super happy whenever I see Puerto Ricans raise their flag and subirlo alto because you have to take advantage of the fact that, there is this freedom. And to think of it as a freedom also is a conversation within it of itself. The role that it plays, I think is significant. I think that Bad Bunny, like he exemplifies in every way, shape, or form his pride and more importantly, his drive to try to, educate the larger masses in regards to the actual colonial state of Puerto Rico.
Another reason why I'm so happy that Gata's on here is because of what you just mentioned, her roots being Panamanian and Jamaican. These are actually the roots of reggaeton, as you'll find out on the Loud podcast. It's the Jamaican dancehall music and the Panamanian rap en Espanol that really got this going. So I appreciate that. Folks should pay attention to that podcast. Charles, reggaeton is a musical genre rooted in resistance, as we talked about. Can you tell us about its origins and why listeners find it to be so powerful, particularly politically?
Well, that's a good question. So part of the challenge is that reggaeton emerges as a way, in some ways, to express or amplify, if you will, sort of popular, sort of real politics that affect, if you will, the average person in sometimes explicit ways. The political dimension of that, of reggaeton and music in Puerto Rico are challenging in some ways because even though there's a dimension of protest that's present, I'm not sure it's very effectual or influential in doing anything. And it's mostly describing social inequalities, if you will. But the question becomes, well, what do you do to change it? What's the project that it's proposed? And sometimes that's not clear that there's a political project there other than a protest.
I want to get into that further. I want to dive into that a little later. First, I'm going to swing back to Petra here and just try to wrap up the Bad Bunny part of the conversation. Censoring of reggaeton in the early 90s. I know it happened to the music in 2004 with a senadora that was on the island that was trying to repeal it as well in like 2004. So how does that influence Bad Bunny? That's happening there.
So that was in 2002 with Senator Velda Gonzalez. So the first one is 1995, where is part of this bigger anti-crime campaign that is happening in Puerto Rico at the time.
Is that Pedro Rosselló?
Yes. So Pedro Rosselló was the governor. He ran partially on this anti-crime platform called Mano Dura that really targeted public housing, among other spaces. And at the time, reggaeton, which was known as underground, was really affiliated, sort of like the soundtrack of those spaces. And so it became sort of the cultural arm, I think, if you will, or I argue in one of my books, the cultural arm of that campaign, that if we can target this music, we can help prevent crime on the island. And then in 2002, I think one of the things that happens is that campaign unwittingly gives reggaeton artists who wouldn't otherwise have a major platform, a platform. And so the music continued to become popular. And in 2002, the censorship campaign is a little bit different. It's more about representations of women and music videos. How does that impact Bad Bunny? I think it's really interesting because Bad Bunny is born in 1994, right? And the record store raids, the first censorship campaign is 1995. So he's a baby, right?
Baby Bunny, yeah.
When Gasolina comes out in 2004 by Daddy Yankee and sort of explodes reggaeton on the global scale, Bad Bunny's only 10, right? So in some ways, I think one of the reasons he's able to do these very creative and different things with his music is a combination of his deep knowledge and appreciation for the history of this genre, combined with the fact that many of his forebears did a lot of that work to make it more mainstream and more accepted in Puerto Rico and by the Latin music industry, which really resisted reggaeton for a very long time. And so I think he is part of a generation of artists we're seeing now, with also people like Rauw Alejandro, Young Miko, right now, young artists who grew up at a time when reggaeton was sort of part of the music establishment, and they can now take it and do these funky things with it.
Speaking of the industry, speaking of establishment, we actually have a caller right now from Bristol. Hola, Peter.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Go ahead. What's your thought this morning?
So I'm very excited you guys are talking about Bad Bunny, being our, to everybody in the world, how is our country, like for real, so. And, I'm so excited. Well, I want to make a question in Spanish because my first language. Can I do that?
Absolutely.
Okay. Yo quiero saber cómo él comercializó tan rápido su música y cómo ha llegado tan lejos.
Gracias, Peter. I appreciate it very much. You got a little chuckle from what Peter said. Go ahead. Your response.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's the question, right? How did this person in less than 10 years blow up and become this global pop star so quickly? Right. I mean, that is the question that I think a lot of us are academics and also people in the Latin music industry are trying to figure out. Like, is there some kind of formula? And I think the other thing that's impressive about Bad Bunny is his attachment to Puerto Rico and attachment to Spanish, right? So it's also been unusual for a Puerto Rican artist to like really make inroads in the U.S. mainstream, for example, without switching to English. So that's a really good question. I don't know if I have an answer. But I think what I would say, and one of the arguments we try to make in our book, is that one of the things that's been very interesting about Bad Bunny, again, that I think I like to, when I talk to my students about this, I like to compare him to like Beyonce, right? Beyonce feels, she's obviously a real person, but she feels sort of untouchable. Like she's out there and we can't access her. And I think Bad Bunny feels very accessible. I think he feels very authentic. I think one of the things I like about him is that he's willing to admit mistakes that he's made, for instance, and describe what he's learning about. And I think that makes him feel sort of like an everyday person who just happens to be this like incredible musical artist. So I think that helps a lot. But, you know, he's got like the magic touch. Like, who knows, really?
We appreciate you calling, Peter. Gracias.
Yeah.
Peter wanting to know how Bad Bunny really able to blow up in 10 years. I think that's really the essence of the
10.
call. Less than 10 years. Oh, my God. And you've been teaching that class for a couple of years now.
Yeah.
That shows you how really quick. And when I think about Beyonce, when I think about Bad Bunny, it's genre bending. We know Beyonce is such a soulful queen, but now there's the country album, there's the electronic album, and there's rumors of what's to come next. Everybody's excited about that. But nonetheless, we're so happy to have Peter call, and I think that's because of the partnership that we have with Somos Connecticut and Rachel Iacovone, who's also Italian, just like I am. But I got to bring this back to good old Connecticut here. Much of Bad Bunny's most recent album pays homage to New York, Connecticut's neighbor, and that matters, right? Connecticut has a sizable Puerto Riqueño population, Boricua.
Oh yeah, I mean, you talked about it for a second. I'm half Italian, half Puerto Rican, so very New York family here and mixture. And I knew that there was a huge Puerto Rican population. Of course, I grew up visiting the Bronx and Spanish Harlem with my family. Did not realize how large of a population we have here in Connecticut. That about 50% of Latinos you run into are Puerto Rican. That people would assume I'm Puerto Rican more than anything else here. And with that, I hear Bad Bunny on the streets. I hear people's car cranked up, on the side of the road, passing me by. That like reggaeton is the basis here is really interesting. I'm originally from South Florida in a very Mexican area, and it was much more like bachata that I was hearing on the street from like a truck, and here is like a very small car playing reggaeton. So
it's so cool. And listening to the Loud podcast that Gata and the rest of the crew put together there at Spotify or with Spotify and Futuro Media too, that Connecticut, not as much as New York, but Connecticut and a little bit of Springfield, Massachusetts, some of those towns in Massachusetts did have, some sway in reggaeton even in Colombia and on the island too. So I mean, there definitely is a place for Connecticut in the reggaeton scene, but Puertorriqueños, they face some barriers when it comes to having their say on what's going on politically, not just not necessarily locally here, because with the diaspora here, but federal elections is what we're thinking about. How much say do they exactly have in those elections?
I mean, the saying is, of course, we pay taxes, but we don't get the benefits of that. And that's because we can vote in the primaries, but on the island, you don't get a say in who the president is, which is kind of the biggest thing, right? You get to vote for the governor, not a president. I want to make that clear. That is a distinction that some do not make. But you get a say in your local representatives, but not how we're represented on the national level. We are part of the U.S., but are we more part of Latin America? And that's kind of the two worlds we live in, one foot in one world at all times. And so the diaspora does get a say. And you see that in areas like here, Orlando, New York, those very large hubs of Puerto Rican populations are now using their voice and voting in ways that they couldn't when they were on the island.
Something that Bad Bunny gets a lot of praise for is trying to expand society's definition of masculinity. Petra, is that something you talk about in your course?
Oh, yes. This is like one of the students' most favorite topics. I think that's another thing when we talk about politics and what political means, right? Like Charles mentioned, what kind of like political change is happening through this music. That's one way to measure politics. But I think another way to measure politics is to think about the role of popular culture in spurring conversations and creating norms, right? Or contesting norms. And Bad Bunny has always challenged ideas about masculinity in his presentation. So, for example, when he first came out, this seems like something silly, but it's actually significant, I think. He was known for wearing sort of flamboyant clothes, brightly colored clothes, and short shorts. And, that's very different from your typical reggaeton artist who was wearing clothing like Sean John, or like, I don't know if anybody even remembers those brands, but, the hip hop styles of 20 years ago. And that little thing of wearing short shorts or eventually painting his fingernails was a huge moment in this culture that is so steeped in machismo, right? And having this very hyper-masculine representation. He then moves on to sometimes wearing women's clothing, right? He's on a very famous cover of him on Harper's Bazaar wearing a skirt and like high fashion women's clothing, and talking about how he's interested in whatever makes him feel good, and how then eventually moving on to saying, he's only publicly dated women, but maybe someday I'll date a man. Who knows? So this kind of expression of fluidity, support of the queer community. I also just want to mention another video that, again, on the surface, is a song called Yo Perreo Sola. It's about a woman who just wants to go to the club and dance by herself, right? In that music video, he famously wears drag, right? And so I think that's a form of politics too, in terms of kind of pushing the envelope of masculinity and creating more acceptance of the queer community in a place that is rife with homophobia and transphobia. So
before we head to break, I want to talk to Gata here. I want to know if you have anything to add to what we just heard from Petra. What other social norms is Bad Bunny sort of challenging in the public sphere?
I'm sorry. I feel like you need to go to break because the amount of long-winded answer that I have.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Take a stab at it, and then we'll figure it out, because I definitely want to hear from you on this.
I'm sorry. I'm just like really caught off guard by all of the fawning for Bad Bunny. I feel like I'd be doing a huge disservice to every Black person that's in the Latin music industry, in the real world, outside of academia. One beautiful thing that my platform did was democratize access to the history of reggaeton. Because, yes, sure, while books were written and articles were written in academia, the public was repeating a lot of things that just simply were inaccurate. And I know there's a lot of shout-outs to Loud, but Perreo 101 was the first podcast to exist in this bilingual format, to storytell reggaeton, to create this tour that I've had nationally, internationally, speaking to the history and the roots and the social paradigms of reggaeton that has inspired Loud, actually. Loud wouldn't even exist without it. And to speak to why Loud isn't up, it's because of this lawsuit that's occurring right now with the Jamaicans suing all of reggaeton. I would be simply doing a disservice by continuing this fawning. I've had major critiques of Bad Bunny in Time Magazine, in public, in my op-ed for Remezcla, because while he does a lot of things that are amazing, and I clap for him for that, there's a lot of things that he is learning in real time and isn't honest about, especially with his connection with Blackness. Yes. And, you know, there's this conversation on his rise. Let's all be for real. There was a void in Latin music because of the betrayal of the supposed and the alleged murder of Kevin Fret by Ozuna. And Bad Bunny and his team intelligently saw this void, and he put on his Superman cape and said, I love the gay people. And that's literally when he started to transform his branding in a very smart and intelligent way. Am I, as a queer person, do I feel seen? Sure. Is that all that is? I mean, maybe because it's very performative. Not my words, the words of actual trans star Villano Antillano. So I'm sorry, there's like a lot of levels here that I'm just like,
sure, and we want you to feel, and we want you to feel.
Like that.
Yeah, we want you to feel comfortable to get at Bad Bunny, because you're not going to be the only person that does that in this show. Charles Venator Santiago also has some opinions that may be unpopular, but we're happy to have him here on the Wheelhouse. We have one more segment left. That's where we're going to get into the bones here. It's not just a Bad Bunny happy hour here. Let's keep doing it here. You're listening to the Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public. We're also encouraging you to call in 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. Still with me, Connecticut Public's Rachel Iacovone, Wellesley College's Petra Rivero Rido, and UConn's Charles Venator Santiago, and La Gata, multimedia artist and historian. Let us know if you're a fan of Bad Bunny's music and politics, or if you're not, call us at 888-720-9677, 720-9677.
Si tienes algunas preguntas o comentarios, únete a la conversación en directo. Llámanos al 888-720-9677. Puedes hacerlo en inglés o en español.
Charles, we have to address some criticisms of Bad Bunny. In the past, you've said you've been disappointed by some of his messaging, or rather, how he's been able to effectuate real change. Get into that more.
So I'm concerned, and this is not just with Bad Bunny. This is in general with the idea that music somehow has a political influence. Because part of what we're seeing is a displacement of traditional leftist politics that are focused on a critique of capitalism, the economic conditions of capitalism, that address the material conditions of people, housing, cheap housing, higher wages, healthcare, etc. And then we move to the sort of protest celebration that focuses on norms and culture at the expense of actual politics, engaging institutions. And I'm worried that when we celebrate or we call artists social critique, we elevate that, or I shouldn't say elevate it, we treat that as a political messaging. We're depoliticizing what are traditional politics. And by that, I mean, we have a civil rights movement that had protests, but also had a political agenda to change legislation. Now, there are some artists that stand behind legislation. I'm not a Swiftie, but Taylor Swift stands behind the Violence Against Women Act, and she supports legislation. She's pushing for some changes for women. And that seems to me a little bit more concrete than simply
You're saying, here's a perfect way to say it. You're saying that Bad Bunny says that he's against Ricardo Rosselló, but he doesn't necessarily pick a successor or pick or get behind a movement and put himself out there as far as he could. You're saying.
Well, no, I mean he did support the Alianza and Dalmau, but he's not offering an alternative.
Okay,
So
there you
every
go.
time he gets involved in politics, we end up with a right-wing candidate or governor. Pedro Rosselló, I'm sorry, Pierluisi, and later Jennifer Gonzalez. So every time he's involved, we end up with this sort of right-wing system of government that's even worse than the one before. But that's not his fault. That's just part of the local culture in Puerto Rico. No, my concern is that if you criticize, say, Luma in El Apagón, what's the alternative that you're offering? Where's that statement? Where's that political argument that you want to offer as an alternative? If you're criticizing colonialism, what's the alternative that you're offering? Is it independence? And what does that look like? And I'm also concerned with the basic focus on social economic conditions of people. I can criticize marketeers and Connecticut Energy all day, but that's not going to lower the price of energy in Connecticut significantly.
Sure. And Gata, you had some thoughts that you shared with us as we were crunched for time last break. But your main criticisms of Bad Bunny, I would say, are around colorism and around whether or not Bad Bunny is actually inclusive to all genders or whether it's performative. Go ahead. Keep going.
So it's, just to be clear, it's not if he's inclusive to all genders, it's that what he's doing is performance. At the end of the day, he's a cis het man. So there's only so much that is, actually happening here. And I super want to applaud what, Charles was just saying, because there's some parallels between his critique and my own, in the sense that I just feel like a lot of artists get a lot of recognition for things that's like, we want a savior. We want a savior. We want a hero in society. And so it's so easy to give credit to these artists and give them more como que inflation of value than, what is actually deserved. And so with that said, I do recognize every single action, directly that Bad Bunny has taken. Am I mad that he's gone in this direction of utilizing, these social paradigms into his marketing? No, because at the end of the day, he's pushing a conversation. Now, is the matter of which some people, talk about him as as if it's God? Yes. And it's at the expense of looking past certain issues. And those issues I can't get past because I'm Black. When it was Ozuna, we never had to question, oh my God, it's a Black guy in the mainstream. I was like, all right, here we go. We don't need, he is incorporating issues of race in his branding. It's just a matter of people have the range to dissect that or not. It's another conversation. But Bad Bunny comes out the woodwork, and it's like, great, we have queer representation. Y lo de negro, everybody's like, I can't tell you how many times I've been called dramatic or, the gaslighting or even bullied or even the death threats that I have received, to speak into this regard. The issue at hand is that Latinidad, we have a race issue, point, period, blank. Entonces, si él está luchando por lo de Latino, that needs to be a part of the conversation. He picked up that torch. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing. If he didn't, I wouldn't even bring this up, but he did. You know what I mean? And so it's like, while you're picking up this torch, you have to answer this question. And to date, I mean, last time he's been asked formally, he said that he was still educating himself. His team came at me, when I wrote my op-ed, and they were like, you could have just written us the theme. I'm like, no, you mess up in public, you get critiqued in public. That's what journalism is.
That's what journalism is.
And today, they ask him, and he's like, oh, I love Pego. And I'm like, so you love one black man when you're asked about your education and race? It looks like there's a lot of education going on.
We only have about...
My point is we need to add layers. Is my entire point.
And thank you for sharing that. I'm sorry to cut you off. We only got about 30 seconds left. I'm going to give it to Petra to talk about the skeptics that you might have in your class.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think I share a lot of the critiques that Gata has around racial politics. I think another layer of this is that, the Jamaicans and the Afro-Panamanians who were creating reggaeton, and then in those 90s years, it was a lot of Black Puerto Ricans who were participating in creating reggaeton, which I talk about in my first book. That they're not getting the same kind of credit that someone like Bad Bunny is getting. So I think that's a big criticism, and Charles too.
Thank you so much to Gata. Thank you to Charles Venator Santiago. Thank you to Rachel Iacovone, and of course Petra Rivero. Keep paying attention to their stuff. You'll see it linked on the web. Today's show produced by Chloe Wynn, edited by Robin Doyen-Aiken and Patrick Scahill. Thank you so much to our visuals team and our ops team here at Connecticut Public. Thank you to our Somos Connecticut team. Thank you for listening to The Wheelhouse.